let me go back. There's a story to how the Renaissance happens. And I don't know, is this the kind of thing that's ever taught in Bangladesh? I mean, why should you? But do you, I'm asking you generically, do you know where the Renaissance comes from? The European Western Renaissance?
The translation of the Arabic to Latins.
No, that's the Middle Ages. With the civil war, in the Umayyad civil war in Spain in the 10th century, at the beginning of the middle of the 11th century, Spain, Al-Andalus, which has been Moorish since about 710, I want to be careful here. I'm going to call it Moorish because there are no Arabs in Spain. They are North African Moors. The language that they use becomes Arabic, but they are not ethnic Arabs, and they're Moorish. And I want to be very careful here because we need to, when we're talking historically, we need to be very careful when we talk about actors in the past, and we call them Arabs. And they may well be Arabic writing, but they are frequently not Arabs. And it's important to see that they are not Arabs. The whole history of Islam is dependent, in fact, on the story of the marginalization of the Arabs from Muslim history. And you may not be taught this. This may be something that's quietly hidden from you, but the Muslim world, at a certain point, simply marginalizes the Arabs. They are removed from power, they are removed from the center and the development of the Muslim culture and Muslim experience. So it's not the Arabs that occupy Spain, it is the Moors, although what they write is in Arabic.
Are the Moor and Berbers are the same people? Berber?
Yes, well, no. The Moors include the Berbers and others. The Berbers are one set of tribes in North Africa. There are other tribes in North Africa that are included in, that are the Muslims in Spain. I mean, what we should talk about is the Muslims in Spain, because that's who they are. They are identified by one thing, they are Muslim. They may come from Egypt, they may come from the rest of North Africa, they may come from northwest Africa, so going down the left-hand side of Africa.
Talk in Arabic language.
Well, they write in Arabic. They probably continue to talk to each other in their original vernacular. Arabic only becomes a lingua, well, never becomes a lingua franca, never becomes a universal language in North Africa. It has never become, so there are to this day different languages in North Africa, but Arabic becomes the second language. And it is, above all, it is a language that is disseminated through writing, because obviously you read the Quran. But often people could recite the Quran and not know a single word of what they were reciting, because they didn't understand the sounds of Arabic, but they had been taught the meaning of the Quran in their vernacular, but they couldn't read Arabic the way you can read English, for example. So we have to be, I'm nitpicking here, but we have to be slightly careful here that we talk about these peoples as Arabic or who spoke Arabic. They don't necessarily speak Arabic, but what unifies them is they are Muslim and they read Arabic. That's the key. So there is this civil war in Al-Andalus in the beginning about 1010, 1020. And this causes the authorities, the Muslim authorities in Al-Andalus to abandon large areas of northern Spain. And because they've been abandoned, the little Christian kingdoms that the Moors had left in northern Spain, the little Christian kingdoms that had been left there from their invasion in 700, 710, 713 AD, those kingdoms had been left as a buffer against the barbarian Christians to the north of the Pyrenees. Those Christian kingdoms began to move south to occupy the central area of Spain. Now what's crucial here is that they occupy it, they don't fight over it. So in a sense, the local governor and the police force had, in the northern half of Al-Andalus, the local governor, who's Moorish, and the police force, which is run by Moors, they have gone south to join in the civil war. But the rest of the population, Jews, Moors, and Arabs, and Spaniards, as it were, indigenous Spaniards, they have been left behind. So what is left behind in northern Spain is probably, in 1020, is probably the richest and culturally most sophisticated part of the Islamic world. Spain, Al-Andalus, by the 10th, the 11th century, is probably the richest and the most culturally sophisticated. Okay, I mean, many other areas of the Islamic world are as well, but probably Spain is the pinnacle. And it falls under Christian control. And it falls under Christian control without warfare. Therefore, the fabric of the society is unchanged. And this, having been the most extraordinarily tolerant society, yeah, tell them to be quiet, because it's been the most, I mean, for 3 centuries now, it's been the most extraordinarily tolerant society, where the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims have got on just fine together, okay, as they're supposed to, according to the Holy Quran, as they're supposed to. They got on just fine. And they are this technologically, intellectually rich society which is working, and as it were, just the governor changes. The governor goes from a Moor to a Christian. And of course what happens is, naturally, the Christians arrive and build churches. Sometimes they will obviously even take over mosques and build the church in the mosques, but usually they will build a separate church. So what happens in Spain in the 11th century is an extraordinary moment where a very sophisticated Moorish society, Muslim society, comes under the rule of Christians who are absolutely barbaric. They have no education, they're virtually illiterate, they have forgotten everything about Greece and Rome, and they are, I mean, I don't want to call them pigs, but they are pigs. Okay, they are, I mean, a very degraded society. We call the previous 500 years the Dark Ages because they were Dark Ages. I mean, after the loss of the Pax Romana, Western Europe goes into a catastrophic economic, social, intellectual, cultural, everything decline.
They got the power to govern the intellectual society.
Sorry, say again?
They got the power to govern the intellectual society.
And suddenly they're in control of Spain. And suddenly they are controlling the most sophisticated culture on earth. So what happens is a massive transfer of culture, technology, and learning. And this massive transfer, first of all, is technology, because the Muslims, they know how to make clear glass. The Europeans don't. They know how to make flat glass. The Europeans don't. They have an enormous apothecary of drugs, which is way bigger than that of the Europeans. They know how to fix dyes to materials. The Europeans don't. They have an alchemy, which is Greek chimea, strengthened by the Arabs and the Muslims. They can make much purer alloys, much better metals, and on it goes. This is. Can you imagine a bunch of the most primitive, I don't know, African tribesmen suddenly gaining control of Silicon Valley? Which is where all the modern digital economy comes from, Silicon Valley in California. Can you imagine a bunch of primitive primitive African tribesmen, who go around naked? Suddenly they're running Silicon Valley. Well, that's what this was. There's suddenly a bunch of Europeans who are basically I mean, they're clothed, but they might as well be naked, suddenly get control of the top end of technology. I think everyone's finding it difficult to hear because I'm having to shout over you. So what follows from this is an incredible transfer of technology from the Arabic world, the Muslim world, into Europe. But more important than that, there is a transfer of learning. For example, we find, I mean, remember that Muslim science is based on Greek science. When the Muslims, I'll talk about this afterwards if you want, I mean in the third session if you want, when the Muslims develop science, for very peculiar and particular reasons, which I'll talk about, they go over and they pick up Greek science, mostly. Not universally, but mostly. So Muslim science is mostly, not universally, Greek science. By the way, do you know the one exception that I'm thinking of? Okay, I'll leave that as an exercise for you to think about. I'll tell you later what is the one exception that you know about. You do actually know about the one place where the Muslims do not pick up Greek science, they pick up something else. I'll come back to it. When the Muslims in the 8th century begin to do science, they just pick up Greek science. So when you go to a library in Arabic in 1050 in Toledo, the town in the center, one of the perhaps the richest town in the center of Al-Andalus of Spain, in 1050. When you go to the library, you will find books on animal husbandry and astrology and astronomy and on beekeeping and leather tanning and making steel, everything, okay? But amongst that, you will find works on Aristotle and Plato and Euclid and Archimedes and Galen and all the rest, well, not all the rest, on a well-defined area of Greek science. So the Arabs have brought on board, the Muslims, not the Arabs, have brought on board a large amount of Greek science, and when the Christians get hold of this, they realize that they have available to them at last the long-lost texts of the glories of ancient Greece. So they start to translate them into Latin. The irony is, when they translate them into Latin, they can't understand them. If I give you today, now I'm presuming, let's say you, sir, because you're a mathematician. So you're supremely clever, but you know nothing about philosophy because you're a mathematician. If I give you a copy of Aristotle, let's say I've got it translated into English or Bengala, so you have no problem with the language. You would take Aristotle and you would read it and not understand it. And you would read it again and not understand it. And you would read it a third time and you would not understand it. Because it's a whole different world, of philosophy, but ancient Greek thinking. So you would have no way of understanding it, even if it was in a good translation in Bengala. So if I had a good Latin translation of Aristotle in 1050 or 1100, it makes no sense to me. And yet I want to read it because I have this cultural memory of Western, the glory of Western thinking being the ancient Greeks. So what are you going to read? Well, look next to this book in Arabic on Aristotle and find the next book which has its title in Arabic, Aristotle for Dummies. Everything you ever wanted to know about Aristotle were afraid to ask. An introduction to Aristotle for goat herders. An introduction to Aristotle for the blind. An introduction to Aristotle for those who know nothing. The Muslims were brilliant at writing introductory texts because they had to. Because you can't understand Aristotle unless you get somebody to give you an introduction to it. So guess what? The Latin West read Aristotle, having first read Muslim introductions to Aristotle. Now, when a Muslim in the 9th century or the 8th century, the 9th century, when a Muslim reads Aristotle and starts to write about Aristotle, what is the first thing a Muslim will do? Think about it. What's the first thing a Muslim will do when reading Aristotle? Well, you have to understand it in terms of Islam. Because which is, as it were, more sure to you in the 8th century? The teachings of Islam or Aristotle? Obviously, Islam is more sure to you, so you need to interpret Aristotle in Islamic terms.
The lens of Islam.
Through the lens of Islam, obviously. I mean, how could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise? So when the Christians in the 11th century come to read Aristotle, they read Muslim introductions to Aristotle, so the Aristotle they come to understand is a Muslim Aristotle. Now, this changes the world. The most important thing I'm going to tell you today is what follows, because it seems that neither the West nor the Muslim world know this. That if I were to go to an ancient Greek and say, why do you do science? And I thought the ancient Greeks do science, huge amount of science. They are the origins of science. You go to an ancient Greek, why do you do science? And they would reply, so as to live in harmony with the world. If you were to go to a Roman and ask them, why do you do science? The Roman would look at you quizzically and say, what is this thing called science? Because the Romans don't do science. And then eventually they would say, oh, when we have to do science, we hire a Greek, because the Romans don't do science. If you go to an early Christian and ask them, why do you do science? The early Christian, and I'm now quoting Tertullian, one of the early Christian Roman writers, who says, this science stuff, is it compatible with the Bible? Does it agree with the Bible? And if you answer yes, then burn it because it's irrelevant, go and read the Bible. And if it's incompatible with the Bible, burn it because it's heretical, go and read the Bible. So in other words, early Christianity actively rejects the idea of what we would call science, because science is useless in your understanding in coming to know God. So early Christianity, down to 500–700 AD, early Christianity has no use for Greek science, because Greek science is pagan and it's not the Bible, it's not Christian, so they reject it. So ask yourself this question: what on earth made medieval Christians start to do science? Where does Christian science, the Western tradition of Christians doing ancient Greek science, where does that come from? What they were reading when they read Aristotle was a Muslim justification for doing science. And it's a very particular justification for science, because the Holy Quran says you must study the world because God gave you the world for two reasons. God gave you the world to farm, to control, to feed you, to sustain you. So the world is given to us to sustain us. And we should do this, and we should be able to control nature so as to feed ourselves, metaphorically. And the other reason you study nature is because God is imbued in nature. The creation of Allah is in nature, so you can learn of God's perfection and God's eternality and so on by understanding nature. So you look at nature to understand God, point number one, and two, God has given you the right, the duty to exploit nature. to use it, to gain knowledge of it, so as to better farm it, to make it do what you want it to do. Now, this is an incredibly subtle, important point. You ask the Greeks, and they never had the idea of using nature, of knowing nature to exploit nature. But the Quran is absolutely clear. You're supposed to learn more about nature so as to farm it better, to make it provide for you better. So the Quran gives you the Islamic duty to control and exploit nature. And this is what the Christians read when they read these Muslim introductions to Aristotle, and they buy into this Muslim idea of science gives you control over nature, therefore allows you to exploit nature. And think about it, all the rest of the history of Western science, therefore all science, because all science is now Western science, is about, think about it, climate change. It's about exploiting nature. It's subduing, learning about nature to make it do what you want to do, to exploit it. We have, for the last 1,000+ years, had an essentially utilitarian view of science. You use science to know more about nature so as to use it to gain profit from it, to make it do what you want to do, to exploit it. And of course, oops, that's turned out to be not such a good idea, we've realized just recently, because we've exploited nature to the point of killing it, which I don't think was in the Holy Quran. I don't think anywhere that's what you're supposed to exploit nature to death. You're of course not supposed to exploit nature like that. So when the Christians come to read Aristotle, they read Aristotle through these introductory textbooks. They learn Greek science, but they don't notice it. But they have learned this Muslim ideology of not doing it to gain knowledge of nature, to live in harmony with nature, but to exploit nature. When I give this lecture in Cambridge, I love giving this, when student societies ask me to give lectures like this, I give this lecture, and I always entitle the lecture, "You're all Muslims, only you don't know it." And you should see how they object to it.
Just repeat again.
Sorry?
I do not understand.
I say to my audience of Cambridge students, you are all Muslims, only you don't know it. You don't know that you're Muslims. Because your whole view of the world, your understanding of the relationship between you as scientists and nature ultimately stems from Islam. Which is why, I'm now going to veer off topic for a bit, which is why I vehemently object to the tradition, both Muslims and Western Christians, or Westerners, to see themselves as separate. Because Islam is an integral part of the history of the West, and Christianity is an integral part of the history of Islam. And we need to stop seeing ourselves as two different ummahs, because did not the Prophet, peace be unto him, say that the ummah of the Jews and the ummah of the Muslims are separate but inseparable? And is that not true of the ummah of Islam and the ummah of the West? That we are in fact inseparable. And okay, we've had wars and we've had, colonialism, and you've murdered Westerners and we've murdered Easterners, and of course, because we all do that to each other all the time. I mean, nobody here has any moral value or any moral standing. So, don't let's fight old wars. But does nobody notice that Islam is profoundly Christian and the West is profoundly Islamic? And the core idea, our science, is ultimately Greek science, plus the most important idea that characterizes our science, that we think of science as giving us tools to govern, to control, to exploit nature. And that is a Muslim idea, and we get it in the Middle Ages. But that's not the Renaissance. That's not the end of the story. Because then there's a second story in the 15th century. And that is when, in the West, we start to get Greek texts from Byzantium. And those Greek texts from Byzantium are still in Greek. They have never been translated out of Greek.
And Byzantium, it was a colony of Greek colony.
Well, it wasn't a Greek colony, it was Rome itself.
It was Rome itself, yeah.
So remember, the Roman Empire in the 2nd century BC, roughly, conquers the Greek world.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. So you've got the Latin world conquers the Greek world. And then, on several occasions after that, the Roman Empire divides into two.
Yeah.
There's the Eastern Empire at Constantinople, and then the Western Empire in Rome. Then the Western Empire collapses around 500 AD. But the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, is now Christianized, but still Greek, and will survive on into the middle of the 15th century. And we forget the long life of the Eastern Roman Empire. And that empire, that world, now called Byzantium, continues to see itself as the continuing Roman Empire. If you go and ask a citizen of Constantinople in the year 1000, tell me your citizenship, they will reply, Romanoi, I am a Roman. They see themselves as Greek-speaking Romans. And because it's a Greek-speaking part of the world, they have maintained a large number of ancient Greek manuscripts. Now, what the Muslims pick up from the ancient Greeks is Greek astronomy, Greek medicine, Greek mathematics, and Aristotle. Those are the four things that the Muslims get from the Greeks. They're not interested in Plato, for example, and they're not interested in lots of other things from the ancient Greeks. From Byzantium, the Western world gets not only Greek Aristotle, Greek texts of mathematics and medicine and so on, but they get a whole pile more stuff. Philosophy, literature, legal writings, treatises, correspondences, plays, everything. But they get two extra bits that I'm particularly concerned about. One is they get Plato. The Muslims have never liked Plato. They've never developed Platonic thinking. There is no Platonic Islamic philosophy because Plato is a dualist. And remind me, there is one God, there is only one God, and that God is God. The first words of the Shahada are monotheistic. They are anti-dualist, whereas Plato is a dualist. So Platonism has always been antithetical to Muslim thinking. So there is no development of Islam, of Platonic Islam. I mean, Averroes is the only Platonist, big Platonist philosopher in Islam, and he is always disavowed by everybody else. So there is no development of Platonism in Islam. So we don't get Platonic texts from Islam, but we get Platonic texts from Byzantium. We also get a whole series of texts which, in the grand scheme of things, appear to be very minor texts, by Frobenius, by Ctesibius, by Hero of Alexandria, by Vitruvius, by Pappus, and Archimedes. And these are texts on what you and I would call applied mathematics. They're basically mathematical engineering, kind of. Okay, they're how to make things, how to make gears and machines and things like that. Now, when these texts come over from Byzantium,